Technologic. Technologic.
All right, everyone, let's get started. Just choose a spot that feels right to you.
Hello. Sorry, excuse me.
Someone's gonna get close. I don't think I've seen you before. Beginners usually take a spot at the front so they can watch me.
Oh, no. I'm pretty familiar with yoga. I'll be okay.
Okay, well, if you need a block or a strap, you just let me know. Everybody's doing great. Gandhi, just toward the ceiling on that up dog, okay?
Oh, do you mean my Urdhva Mukha Svanasana?
No up dog. Don't worry, you'll learn the terminology. Gandhi, you gotta pick up the pace. You're not gonna burn any carbs. You're doing great, but maybe next time try and wear appropriate yoga attire. Okay, maybe a lycra top.
This is a traditional Indian dhoti. I spun it myself.
Right. There's a Lululemon down the street.
Is this Coldplay? Yep. This is definitely Coldplay.
I'm on a juiced fast,
Cool. Oh, you're fasting. What for? To protest imperialism?
beach season.
Beach season.
Alright, let's keep it down. This is a place of quiet reflection.
I'm pretty sure this is a Crunch gym. There's a guy giving out sports drinks right there.
You look thirsty.
Are you kidding me? This is a Yankee Candle. Cinnamon bun.
With all due respect, Mahatma, I am a certified yoga instructor.
Oh, really? Who was your guru? Carl Smith, but an honorable yogi.
I really want to try a yoga Pilates class.
Oh my god, that is so
I
spiritual.
will give anyone $10 if they can tell me who this is. Anyone? No, I didn't think so. It's Krishna, 8th incarnation of Lord Vishnu. Learn it.
Why does it seem stressed? Just take a breath and flow your chakras down into your heart center.
I'm leaving. You don't know what that means.
Good morning and welcome to Uptown Community Church. And if you're visiting with us, I am so sorry you had to watch that. That was a video that literally up till last night I was deciding whether I wanted to show or not. I'll unpack it in a little moment. But thank you so much for joining us. We're continuing on a series that basically what the idea behind this series is we are looking at world religions. And we're looking at different worldviews and how we kind of interact with people in the world. So this morning, it's going to be a bit of a doozy, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's just recap what we talked about last week. So we've been looking at this idea about where truth comes from, right? So remember last week we looked at this idea of cults, and we looked at particularly at Mormonism. And I kind of went off on a tangent, which again is pretty typical for me. But the idea is that one of the things you'll encounter more and more as you're out in the world, as you're interacting with people, everybody has an idea of what is true. The question you have to investigate a little bit more is, where does that truth actually come from? So in Galatians chapter 1, verse 8, we start off by talking about this. Let God's curse fall on anyone, including us or even an angel from heaven, who preaches a different kind of good news than the one we preach to you. What's interesting is people have a real misunderstanding about angels and angel theology, in the sense that if you look at angels, a lot of cults and religions start off with a divine revelation from an angel, which is interesting because angels in the Bible are always like, whoa, don't worship me. Don't do anything like, because I'm like you. So that's kind of interesting how people would use that. But I understand if you want to supplant or supersede another religion, God told me, that's always a good thing. Although I didn't say this last week, and I probably should have. You know, I grew up in a particular type of denomination where people would use the phrase, God spoke to me. God told me. And again, we believe that in the immediacy of God's presence, that God can speak to us. We believe that. But whatever God says, it's always going to be in alignment with his scriptures. So when someone said to me many years ago, God told me that he wants me to be happy, therefore I should divorce my wife. That actually happened. And I'm a youth pastor, so I don't care. I'm going to tell you the truth. But, that conversation was a little bit more uncomfortable after that. But people will say things like that. And so we have to always remember, whether it's kind of an angel or our preferential idea of what God wants for us, it's always going to be in alignment with the Bible. Well, so we look at this idea of postmodern cults. So I said to you, the classical definition of a cult will either modify Jesus or modify the Bible. But that's not what we're dealing with now. Postmodern cults is this idea, it starts off with a problem, right? So it's a problem with yourself, with the world, with productivity, with wealth. So people will say things like, are you healthy enough? Or are you productive enough? Or are you are you having enough wealth? And these type of things, right? And then from there, it's like, by the way, you can't trust institutions. You can't trust the government. You can't trust. And again, we see this. There is a deep, deep mistrust of institutions. Institutions like government, schools, churches, right? These are all institutions that once held at least some recognition of authority, but now not so much at all. And then what happens next is this idea of special knowledge. I have learned, I have discovered, I can show you. Right? Remember, the guru always has a special revelation. And again, I said to you last week that Christians have a way of kind of using Christianese language to this, right? In regards to like wealth and other things too, right? So it's like, no, God wants you to be happy and prosperous. Does he? Because I don't remember the Bible saying that. I don't remember the cross being this wonderful thing that I want to have in my life, as opposed to, how Jesus kind of discovered it. So we have this idea of looking at it. We wrapped up by looking at this passage from Matthew, right? And I think it's so fascinating that Jesus says this phrase, right? So, and again, it's like, blessed are those who don't fall away, stumble because of me. Now, the idea behind this is that we all have expectations of God, expectations of Jesus. And when God and or Jesus fails to meet those expectations, what do we do? What do we do? Right? And so I think it's so interesting that oftentimes if Jesus really isn't everything, if our pursuit of God isn't, if it doesn't hit every area of our life, then we will find ways to supplant it and to kind of maybe add other things. It's the Jesus and moment. So what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to show you, as a religion or as a worldview, we start off with an idea, right? And we say to ourselves, this idea is a hypothesis. Hypothesis is just a fancy word for testing an assumption, right? We want to test an assumption. So remember we looked at a couple weeks ago this idea of atheism. What does an atheist say to us? He says, she says, they say that, you can be good without God. We don't need religion to actually be good people. And so I said, okay. And another thing that they say, is that it's rational to, it's irrational to believe in God. So let's test that hypothesis. And we did that, right? Using available data. And remember I told you I wasn't going to tip the scales in God's favor. I was just going to use data that's available to us. So I used the World Health Organization. I used like data that's readily available, but again, not Christian. And what we found was, as we tested this hypothesis, is this was actually untrue. That you actually do need God to be good. That actually it is intrinsic to the human nature to believe in something transcendent. And again, this is widely recognized across many different disciplines. So we take an idea and we say to ourselves, well, this idea, how do we know whether this idea works? Well, there's data points, right? And by data points, I just mean, what's the idea that you're trying to look for? There's going to be some information extrinsic to the idea that's either going to verify it or nullify it. Now, please understand something very clearly here. My understanding of Christianity isn't just belief. I have never tried to say that to anybody else, nor have I ever said that to myself. Just believe. Right? Because that can be a bit of a cop-out that Christians can say. So when the world pushes back, well, you don't have faith. The writer of Hebrews tells us, without faith, it's impossible to please God. But the gorgeous thing is that God gives us these steps. There is an ultimate leap of faith for sure. But the point up to that, there is many reasons why believing in God is a rational idea. So we take this idea and we test it and we ask ourselves, does it work? Does it actually work? Right? Atheism, does it actually work to make us better people, to make the world a better place to live in? The answer, according to all available data, is absolutely not. But the problem is we don't take this idea as a hypothesis. We take it as, oh, well, it's up to us now to prove this. So what's interesting is oftentimes we answer questions that are actually wrong questions. So someone says to us, well, it's religion is the leading cause of death and war and violence in the world. And we go, wow, they might be right. Instead of maybe we should probably say, well, prove that. Just prove that statement. Because you're making the statement as if there's lots of data to support that. Now, I know you're like, well, I don't have any flowcharts or PowerPoints with me, but where exactly do you get this data from? Oftentimes when you push into these assumptions, most often people don't have reasons for it. It's just, this is what I believe. Or they'll rely upon some social media person to kind of give them this information. But again, push into it and maybe sit down with them and let's research this. How do we kind of find out whether this hypothesis is true? So when we talk about these ideas of different religions, we're going to ask ourselves, do these religions actually make the world a better place, however you want to define that? This morning, we're going to look at one of my favorite ones to poke at. But before we get there, just a couple of ideas I want to throw out to you. One of the things we have done as Christians is we have created this dichotomy. And the dichotomy looks like this: sacred, secular. Right? So when I was growing up, I was told that secular music was sinful. And secular music was anything that didn't say Jesus or God in it. Now, that's what I was told because I grew up in the 80s. And apart from the horrible music, well, actually, no, the music was okay. Horrible dress style. Okay, there you go, fashion. Like acid wash coming back. Come on, people. Have we not learned our lessons? Anyways, in the 80s, it was told to me that I couldn't listen to this type of music because it was sinful. So my question was, well, what makes it sinful? Now, just to be clear, there is music out there that I think would be definitely something that would not be something that maybe would be good for our mental, emotional, spiritual health, for sure. But for the most part, I love jazz. Right? Montreal Jazz Festival, it's kind of my jam, right? That's kind of how I roll. But one of the fun facts about jazz is that it's mostly instrumental. But because it wasn't condoned by the church, I remember people saying to me that this is secular music. I'm like, well, there's no words. Like, is the pentameter wrong? Is it like the skid blah blah? Like I don't understand. Like, could you help me understand? Now, I'm being tongue in cheek. I might be being a little bit sarcastic, but the point simply is that we created these kind of dichotomies of saying, well, this is good, and this is bad. Now, I believe those terms do exist, but the Bible has a different way of defining them, and the way the Bible defines it is sinful, not sinful. That's how the Bible would define this understanding. So Brent Joseph says this way: God created life to be a spiritual experience within the material world. To say that we do not experience God or do not come into contact and experience spiritual things, paranormal events, or have a deeper knowing that something else is going on behind the scenes would not be fair to most of our life experiences. Even for those who do not profess Christian faith, the majority of humanity acknowledges that life at its core is spiritual. I think that's absolutely true. I've said this before, and I'll just remind you. You are flesh-wrapped souls. Now, I want you to kind of transform your understanding because we think of flesh and the soul as a secondary part. You are actually a flesh-wrapped soul. So your body, however it may be, however you are pleased or are not pleased with it, is not your eternal jar. That there's something inside of it that will transcend it and will move beyond that. And so we are actually spiritual beings that are wrapped in flesh, and that our flesh is what interacts with the material world. Jesus.net has this kind of interesting way of saying as well, too. It says this: you can look up the word spiritual in every book of the Old Testament, from the first book, Genesis, to the last book, Malachi, and you will not be able to find it there. Why? Because the ancient Hebrew worldview, all of life is spiritual. So to the Jewish people, there wasn't this idea of, oh, this is unspiritual, and this is not spiritual, or this is sacred, and this is not sacred. To the Jewish mindset, everything was spiritual. Everything was spiritual. Which brings us to this next point, of this idea of like, okay, if everything is spiritual, then how should we be engaging with the world? Pew Research came up with this great study a couple of years ago that I want to share with you in regards to where we're going to go this morning. Most American adults self identify as Christians, but many Christians also hold what are sometimes characterized as New Age beliefs, including belief in reincarnation, astrology, psychics, and the presence of spiritual energy in physical objects like mountains or trees. Many Americans who are religiously unaffiliated also have these beliefs. Overall, roughly 6 in 10 American adults accept at least one of these New Age beliefs. Pew Research surveyed Americans to see what they thought about the following 4 New Age beliefs. Spiritual energy exists in physical things, psychics have the reliable insight to the future, reincarnation, and astrology. Not only did 62% of the general public hold at least one of these New Age beliefs, 61% of professing Christians held one as well. It's kind of interesting if you think about it, and where we want to go this morning is that when we think about what we believe, where does truth come from? Oftentimes we believe, especially as Christians, well, we just believe the Bible. It almost makes me wonder if there's other Bibles out there that I don't know about. Because when sometimes Christians talk about things, I'm like, oh, I've never heard of that before, thought about that, or understood the Bible in that way, right? Because it's almost as if there's a secret or another type of Bible out there that people are using that I just don't seem to have access to. Like either it's a smaller version or it's blacked out or it's like post-modern. I don't know what it is, but when I have a conversation with another Christ follower, it seems kind of a weird because we're not saying the same thing. Happened to me 3 days ago. Talking to a Christian who's gone to church their entire lives. They said something, and I went, oh, okay, never heard that before. Actually, I had. But I'm like, okay, so tell me, where's that come from? And they began to kind of give me a little bit of their, like, because of the context, I didn't kind of engage too much, but I was just curious. Okay, so how do you come to this conclusion about God, about the Bible, that I would never have thought a Christ follower would? But again, what we're seeing here is this idea that Christians are increasingly not using the Bible as their reference point for how we engage with the world, but instead other things. 61% would be, I would say, more than a tipping point. So 61% of Christians actually hold what we call New Age beliefs, and we'll unpack that in a second. Now, just to remind you of the study from Oxford University, to be a believer in something transcendent is part of the human condition. And this is what the data and the research tells us. So remember, when an atheist says it's irrational, what am I, Southern? Irrational to believe in something, supernatural. To the atheist, they'd say, well, see, this is irrational. But again, all the available data is telling us actually this is not true. That there's something about human beings that we can't quite pinpoint in our evolutionary development, if that's the way you want to look at it. There's something about us that looks at the material world and goes, no, it's incomplete. And that incompleteness is a question we need to ask ourselves. It's that scratch that we just can't quite itch. Where does that come from? And if you look through psychology, if you look through humanists, right, whether it's Freud, whether it's Jung, whether whoever you might look at, Hegel, Descartes, everybody's trying to kind of quantify this, but it's really been unsatisfactory, right? Because you cannot, again, a material world being cannot imagine a world apart from that. If we think of ourselves as like, no, we came from here, we developed this way, and this is who we are. Well, then why do we believe that there's more? And again, if you read the literature on this, it's very, very unsatisfactory. And it's actually, I think, sometimes just downright lies. Because one person I was reading said, oh, it's a delusion. Well, how is it an unreached people group in history, in the world, has this same delusion? Because you say this delusion comes from Western culture, but this country here and this people group was not even encountered Western culture, and they seem to have this belief as well. Where does that come from? Well, I don't know. Okay, yeah, that's fine. But again, if your theory is to be true, it has to be true. It has to be consistent. It can't be this, maybe it's this. Like, no, be consistent. So one of the things we have to understand is that there is nothing that is spiritually neutral. This is really kind of important for me to kind of, from where we're going to go from here. I think Christians today have created this middle world that we don't think God exists in. That we seem to think that, well, God doesn't really care. And I get the idea, it's this, what does God want me to wear today? Well, whatever it was, it's not that. I no, maybe that's not how we look at it. But that overemphasis on God's will on all that. I understand that part. But I do want to say that I think that we have kind of diluted, misunderstood what it what it means to be in the kingdom of heaven. That there is nothing in our lives that is spiritually neutral. Okay, so last week we looked at this idea of cults offer certainty in uncertain times. So I said to you that let's not think about cults as large groups now, but let's think of cults as micro cults, influencers, right? Individuals that have maybe like a small following. It could be maybe a couple of thousand, a couple of hundred, maybe even a couple of million. But in regards to the entire world population, still not that much. But if there's all these voices out there that are saying things, again, you don't need to have a large following. You just need to have a whole bunch of voices saying really weird things and people going, yeah, that seems about right. You know, so it micro cults. Well, this morning we're looking at this idea of New Age beliefs. And what New Age offers better than anything else is peace in chaotic times. Now, you can see why these two are especially attractive in the context we're in today. Because the times we're living in feel very uncertain. And again, we have felt fearful for a couple of years. But with that fear is also on the other side of this now are all these people saying, well, this is how we get healthy, or this is how we become, peaceful and all these type of things. It's like, okay, so what does that look like? Before I jump into that, I try as much as possible because a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about is not really scriptural, so I want to maybe bookend this. Right? But the beautiful thing about this is that what we're experiencing today, this is not brand new. Right? One of the things I love about studying history is oftentimes people arrive at history going, well, this seems brand new today. Actually, it's not. If you look back in history, this question, this thinking, this religion, this idea, it's been around. Right? It's been around. The psalmist says this in Psalm 115, verses 2 to 8. It says, why do the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in heaven. He does whatever pleases him, but their idols are silver and gold, made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, noses but cannot smell. They have hands but cannot feel. Feet but cannot walk, nor can they utter a sound with their throats. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. What I love about this passage is a couple of things. One, you become what you worship. You become what you worship. If you worship something that doesn't speak to you, talk about you, care about you, you become what you worship. Right? This has been around in the ancient world, and it is around today. So with all that, let's take a look at this idea of the New Age movement, but really look at its origins and kind of show you how it has, again, 61% of Christians seem to believe a tenet or an idea within this movement. So let's take a look. Let's define terms. The New Age movement is an eclectic combination of many different psychological, philosophical, and religious ideas from around the world. It emerged after the countercultural hippie movement of the 1960s and began to truly blossom in the 1980s. You're welcome. The New Age is essentially a humanistic psychology, 80s style, with the addition of neo-shamanism, channeling, crystal and herbal healing, and this sort of thing, says Terence McKenna, ethnobotanist and psychonaut. I don't know what that means, okay? The original driving force behind the New Age movement was to liberate humanity from the dry, rigid, life-denying, and in many cases, dangerous ideas propagated by Orthodox religion. Now, this is absolutely true. Not in regards to their ways of looking at it, but I will say something about Christianity. If you study Christian history, you will realize that Christian history has gone through different phases. And in those different phases has been a reaction from culture to those phases. And there was a point in time where Christianity was seen as rigid, as dry, non-experiential, liturgical, so that those coming to it would feel this sense of like absence. Right? And again, I acknowledge that as being true. Now, we've gone the exact opposite direction, but that's a different conversation. Well, actually, that's a conversation for next week. But we started off there, we go, well, that's what it's like. So the New Age movement really, in my opinion, starts off in February 1968 with a band called the Beatles. Hot take, unpopular take, Beatles widely overrated in music, in my opinion. And for those of you who disagree with me, you're absolutely wrong. What I love about this photo is this is actually taken in India, where the Beatles went to a pilgrimage there because they did their first American tour, and they were wildly successful, but they were burnt out. And so they felt this lack, so they started delving into dabbling with this idea of Eastern religion. And this photo was one that was wildly plastered. Now, I just want to point out this photo here because something kind of makes me chuckle about this because these are my people now, okay? Is, of course, you have the Swami in the middle there. He's raking it in, so good for him. But everybody in this photo here, I don't know how to gently say this, but it's different shades of white, except for that one woman in the top left there. And I just wonder what her face is and what she's thinking at this moment in time. Like, how did I get relegated to the back here when this is really, we're in India, people. Should I be at the front? But when this kind of hits the front here, this is now when the Beatles kind of sanctified, and I use that word intentionally, or when they kind of said, hey, this is any alternative to your Western religion. People kind of go, oh, okay, fair enough. So now what does New Age actually believe? And what are the origins of it? So let's unpack that a little bit. So what do New Agers actually believe? Well, the New Age movements are very diverse. There are a few common themes that they build on. The two most important are, now this is important here, when we're talking about the New Age movement, it's not a phrase that you will think of, but as soon as you start talking about the terminology, you'll pick up on it. Because it's everywhere, but it's not called what it's called. Right? So the first idea is this self-spirituality. According to New Agers, spiritual awakening could be achieved through the exploration of the individual self. The aim of many New Age practices is for the individual to connect with their true inner self, which lies beyond their socialized self. Now, for those of you who are intuitive, you should be picking up on some language here. That there can be a disconnect between the inner you and the outer you. Well, I can't imagine where culture's talking about that right now. I can't, this is happening now. But again, where does it come from? Where does this idea of a disconnect between what you are and what you could be, or what you are in the inside versus what you are on the outside? Secondly, is this idea of detraditionalization. It's a made-up word, but you get the idea. New Agers reject the authority of spiritual texts like the Bible and hierarchical religious organizations like the church. According to New Age theory, individuals discover the truth for themselves through personal experience. The aim of New Agers was to find perfection within themselves instead of searching for it in an external God. So one of the things New Agers will say is, your churches, there's no God there. God's within you. And again, when it comes to spiritual texts, I was going to go to the Bhagavad Gita, but it doesn't matter because those aren't necessarily the spiritual texts that they may adhere to. So it doesn't matter about me kind of like I would do with Mormonism or with the Quran, going, hey, here are the spiritual texts, because there are none, and there are everything. Everything is a spiritual text, and nothing is a spiritual text. So how do I unpack that? I can't. So these are the ideas behind it. Now, these are the two main ones that have this idea of self-spirituality and the detraditional way of understanding it. But there are four things that that really kind of fall under. Aside from these two basic tenets, there are a few other themes that run through the majority of New Age practices. One, nature is sacred. Inspired by ancient pagan religions, New Agers believed in the sacred powers of the earth. Many practices took place in nature or taught the admiration of love of natural beings. Vegetarianism, veganism, and the ethical treatment of animals are all common themes in different New Age movements, NAMs. Now, just to be clear, you can be a vegetarian. You can be a vegan. You can enjoy nature. I love me some nature. I've said this before and I'll say it again. If I was going to create a church, it'd be outdoors. Right? I love me some nature. But what I don't do is assign nature something sacred apart from the creator who created it. It's a very important distinction. But when New Agers say something like, well, the earth is sacred, kind of go, yeah, oh, okay, sure. But again, you have to understand something. What we assign to be sacred and what we think of as having value in a supernatural sense, we have to be very careful because, again, the door, the path, again, is all about that. So how do we see this out? Well, the Avatar movies, right? Gaia, right? Infinity War, right? Thanos, right? We're running out of we're running out of resources, so if I'm going to snap my finger, I'm going to get rid of half the population so people can live properly. By the way, that's actually an environmental theme. The Russo brothers, believe it or not, created this movie just as an idea behind the underpinnings behind it, that this is environmental theory. That what we need to do is decrease human population because we're running out of resources. I think that there's a great conversation to be had in regards to how we use resources and the wastefulness of Western culture. Absolutely. But I don't want to exterminate half the planet. So the Russo brothers kind of created this, and the thing is that, people kind of missed out on the idea behind this, the ecological idea behind this, and the Russo brothers kind of putting it out there is like, by the way, this is not a great idea. But because, you have Robert Downey Jr. and Captain America, people kind of missed it. Well, I get that, but that was their idea behind it. Mysticism, the belief in mysticism, in the psychic abilities of certain individuals and the existence of healing powers of spiritual energy is widespread amongst New Agers. Again, this is true. Right? Mysticism is very, very highly regarded today. Belief in destiny. Here's a fun one. New Agers tend to believe that we all have a predetermined fate. The hints of this destiny might be accessed through such practices as tarot reading and astrology. Now, just a quick note here. Spoiler alert. You don't actually have a destiny. You have a purpose. You don't have a destiny. Do you see the difference between the two phrasing? The idea of a purpose is this idea that God created within you, gave you abilities and gifts, gave you affinities, gave you passions, and He will use that for the kingdom, to interact with people, to interact with the world. But it doesn't mean that you have a predetermined way of getting to that. So when Christians have gotten to this idea of destiny, and really it can be phrased as the will of God. Right? What's God's will for my life? If I go to this school or I go to that school, if I date this person, I date that person, or if I take this job, I take that job, what's God's will for my life? This is a misunderstanding of God's will. Because I know this sounds horrible to say, God doesn't care what school you go to. He doesn't. The question He really wants to know is, does Jesus go with you? See, when we've got so wrapped up in this idea of God's will, we've actually entwined with it this idea of destiny. Thinking that, if I miss out, right? For those of you who might be single in this room, and the question you're asking yourself is, where do I find that perfect person? Spoiler alert, there is no perfect person. There isn't just one person God has for you. Because in my mind, if the perfect person for me is in Australia, how am I ever going to meet them? Because I don't want to go to that country because they have big spiders. If my perfect person is Australia, that's it. I'm single for the rest of my life because I'm scared of spiders. Okay, so that's really how it works. But to see why within this idea of Christian culture, this idea has kind of been there and we've kind of adopted it, but really it's an unbiblical idea. Again, I'm going to push back on some of this the way he's saying, just point out to me one time where Jesus says and uses the word destiny for His disciples. Spoiler alert, not once. Right, so this idea of destiny is very much a theme that finds itself in this idea of the New Age movement. Hollywood, you have a destiny. I would love to have a destiny. That makes me feel more important about myself, but that's really just, narcissism, which again, we're going to get to in a second as well too. But that's really a beautiful way of thinking about it. But that's not how the Bible thinks about it. And holism, we're going to unpack that a little bit more. The belief that we're all universally connected is common in the New Age theory. Now, holism actually is a Hindu idea called monism. One of the most distinctive beliefs of the New Age movement is monism, the belief that all of reality is essentially one. From this perspective, everything that exists is part of a single organic whole. There are no real differences between people, between objects, or between people and objects. Monism holds that everything is one substance, so humanity is no different from God, who is no different from the grass that grows on your front yard. We're all related to each other. We are all dependent on each other. Our differences are in our energy, vibrations, and abilities, but not in our value. Now, understand something. You can take this and you can create a mission statement for a church. Let me show you how. God created everything. And because God created everything, we are all part of that creation. And in that creation, the squirrel is as valuable as you. I just want you to know something. That's not true, okay? I just so you know, I'm not sitting on my deck with a BB gun trying to pick off squirrels. No, I'm not. I really am not. The point simply is this. The writer of Hebrews says, what is human beings that you place them even above the angels? See, the Bible seems to think that humanity, because we have the Ruach, we have God's Spirit within us, we're different than animals. I am not saying, because of course, whenever I say something like this, I'm like, well, are you saying we should, beat up animals? No, don't be a sociopath. But it just means that we take value in creation, but we realize that humanity, no matter how horrible they are still in a different category than that. You and grass, you're not equal. Okay? You're not equal. But again, monism is a Hindu term for that. Now, Hindus have been taking notice of Western co-optation of Hinduism. So the video I showed you at the very beginning is by a website called College Humor, and it's very crass, and you could tell with the video it was heavily edited for bit language, and I was really struggling whether I should show it. It's even in that it's a really bad clip in the sense of like how I couldn't find a 720 or 1080. Why? Because College Humor actually removed the video from their website. They got a lot of pushback because it was such a contrast between true Hinduism, i.e. Gandhi, and basically the Lululemon leotard wearing kind of rendition that we have today. By the way, I know I work next to the Lululemon store in the mall, so I'm not unaware of what I'm about to say to you, right? So the reason this video was pulled because it was too harsh. So I love when the yoga instructor says, Gandhi, let's work on your up dog. And Gandhi says, oh, you mean, and he gives the actual Hindu term for it. No, I mean up dog. Oh, okay. So this is Hinduism has kind of picked up on this. Rajiv Malik, who writes for Hinduism Today, a great website in regard to understanding Hinduism. Remember I told you I'm not going to go to Christian ones. I'm going to make sure they get to speak for themselves. This is what he says. The New Age is a movement that became popular in the West in the 1960s and 70s, and at that time it carried a clear Eastern pedigree, drawing from Hindu mysticism and Western occult teachings that appealed to the idealist counterculture then in the ascendancy. But over the course of the 80s and 90s, virtually all overt signs of Hinduism fade away. New Age authors writing for this is important, Christian and Jewish readership retained popular Sanskrit words in their books, such as chakra, but with a non-specific spiritual connection. Cut from its Eastern roots, the still popular New Age morphed from a quasi-religious movement to a loose spiritual philosophy with a strong marketing angle, aimed at primarily at women, promoting health, beauty, inner peace, and successful relationships. So, just to be clear, Hindus have noticed, right? They've noticed that we've kind of stolen their religion and rebranded it. The New Age belief is a perfect combination of religious abstraction and modern Western narcissism. Because, like I said to you, I can't pin down to a religious book. I can't point to you because it's not. It's an amalgamation. It's buffet. And the reason why Western culture loves it so much, it's the form of godliness but denying the power thereof. See, what we are spiritual beings. We start off talking about that. But if you're a spiritual being, guess what? You are going to crave something spiritual. But you look into a church, you're going, really? Stained glass? Organs? Or rock music and tattooed preachers or whatever. That's spiritual, right? We've lost this idea of reverence and awe for our Creator. And so we've tried to kind of, whichever end of the pendulum you want to talk about, fair enough. But the point simply is, the world, the culture has noticed our religion and kind of going, what does it say to us when people come and say, well, I don't sense God's presence. it should be a wake up call for how we are living, how we are thinking, and how we are trying to tell people who and what we are. But what's interesting about the New Age movement is that we are still spiritual, so we're still going to seek spiritual things. Uh, Lindsay Mendewalt from a website called Mama Bear Apologetics. By the way, it's a great website for apologetics. She calls herself a Mama Bear apologetic. Uh, that's her term. She's really, really smart, so I'll leave it at that, right? She says this, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly to you, the New Age movement is about much more than hippies, incense, and Enya. And it's extremely relevant in today's world. The New Age movement's history flows from Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and the human potential movement and mysticism, and sometimes it's difficult to nail down what a New Age thinker might well think. Some might say it's a choose your own faith type of belief system. Think of someone like Oprah next week. That said, most New Agers believe that human transformation is possible when people open themselves up to a spiritual energies that are available to every human being. She's not wrong. See, the origins of the New Age movement, and the reason why I don't really go into it too much, is Hinduism, is Buddhism. We'll talk about that in a second, but the point simply is you were to say to somebody who ascribes to this stuff, well, are you a Hindu or a Buddhist? They're like, well, I'm neither. It's slippery. And designed so for it. Again, another a website called The Heart of Hinduism says this. The Hindu concept of God is ultimately impersonal, and any personhood is anthropomorphic. The various gods and goddesses and the stories about them are merely ways which Hindus relate to an impersonal supreme. The Advaita, the non-dual or monistic schools, consider the soul one with God in all respects. The numerous deities are considered more or less imaginary, representing aspects of the formless, all-pervading world soul, Brahman. For Advantis, God is therefore entirely impersonal, though represented anthropomorphically for our own understanding. He is nirguna, without qualities. Now, why am I saying that? If you're going to create a God, you want that God not to care about you. Why? Because a God that doesn't care about you doesn't require anything from you. And this has horrific consequences, and we'll look at this in a second. Two people will comment on that. One first by Oz Guinness, another by Doreen Virtue. Doreen's actually really interesting because she actually comes out of this and encountered Christ, but they both have something interesting to say about this. The first thing Oz Guinness says, the swing to the east has come at a time when Christianity is weak. At just these points where it would need to be strong to withstand the East. Without this strength, the Eastern religions will be to Christianity a new, dangerous Gnosticism. Gnosticism, secret knowledge. But this time, much of the fight will be lost before many see the nature of the danger. See, just so you know, I'm telling you about this, but we've already lost. When 61% of Christians believe and ascribe to New Age beliefs, it's over, people. We just don't know it. Do you see why we're talking about this? Doreen Virtue says this, New Age practices are similar to alcoholism. They are progressive and people crave more and more intensity. They may start out with something that seems innocent, but always leads to darker experiences. So Doreen, when she talks about her experience in New Age, starts off like this. Are you healthy? No, actually, I'm not getting enough exercise, and I just feel anxious all the time, and there's so much noise in the world. Well, her friend invites her to a yoga class. Sure, she goes. And she does a yoga class, and she feels like, oh, there's peaceful music, peaceful things. Oh, okay, wait a minute, something's here, right? She feels peaceful. Well, as the yoga class progresses, she gets invited to a spiritual retreat. And at the spiritual retreat, she's introduced to rubbing, which is taking ashes, rubbing them on you. It's crystals, it's all this, and she's like, oh, okay. And of course, the spiritual retreat, gorgeous. It's wooden. She describes the lodge it goes into. It's beautiful. Right? But again, they're going outside amongst the trees and all that. It's always good to have a spiritual retreat when there's nice weather. If there's hurricane weather, that might be a whole different conversation. But it was nice weather, so she goes on and she progresses. But she comes to the heart of this belief system, which we'll get to in a second. She realizes something. All that she was taught, all that she was told, spoiler alert, was a lie. And her transformation was this idea that there's something missing from this belief system. Don't worry, I'll show you in a second. And that's where she begins to go back to this idea of looking at Jesus, but not Jesus as she understood it, but Jesus of the biblical Jesus. And they started looking at Christianity not as she was been told it, but historical. I know this seems kind of weird, and we'll get to this towards at the very end of the series, but just so you know, Christianity, apart from its flubs and foibles, which they are them for sure, the Crusades called, we actually do really well historically in regards to what we offer to the world. Remember, a hypothesis that we get to test. What are the data points? Well, we'll look at that at the very end. Leslie Newbegin, I showed this quote before, but Leslie is somebody I've been listening to, reading a lot more of, because his approach to looking at this idea of a Christ follower is as a missionary. And as a missionary, what's really important is to, when you as a missionary, when you go to another culture, the first thing you want to do is understand the culture before you start talking about Jesus. Why? Because that culture may not understand the context of Jesus. So what Leslie is saying is that we as Christ followers, we have to understand the culture before we start talking about Jesus. Because the Jesus that we're talking about is the 1960s, 70s, 80s Jesus, and the culture is postmodern. We're past that. So what he says is this, and I think it's really important. He says this: when Gladstone foretold is essentially what has been happening during the 140 years since he wrote those words. The result is not, as we once imagined, a secular society. Pause. We think that we're moving towards secular society, a society without religion and God. The actual truth is we're moving towards a non-Christian society, but a still spiritual society. It is a pagan society, and its paganism, having been born out of the rejection of Christianity, is far more resistant to the gospel than the pre-Christian paganism with which cross-cultural missions have been familiar. Here surely is the most challenging missionary frontier of our time. So what we're dealing with right now is this idea of saying, okay, we're not dealing with people who are actually even interested in Jesus anymore. You can't even have a conversation about what God is without defining terms. It's a much more longer, nuanced kind of a conversation pre-Jesus. And we're going to talk about that. Now, what did Doreen find out about the truth about Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and the New Age movement? Well, let me show you in an odd way, which for those of you part of UCC is kind of how I roll. The 2021 Human Trafficking Report says this: Afghanistan, Algeria, Burma, China, Comoros, Cuba, Eritrea, Iran, Nicaragua, North Korea, Russia, South Sudan, Syria, Turkmenistan, Venezuela remain classified as Tier 3. They are joined by Guinea-Bissau and Malaysia in this year's report. What the heck is going on here? We're just talking about Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, the New Age movement. How do we end up in human trafficking? I'm glad you asked. Because what's interesting and what Doreen discovered at the very core of Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, the New Age movement is, you guessed it, you as a human being, you have no value. You have no value, you have no worth, and to ascribe worth to that is against the teaching. Don't believe me? Great, let's take a look. Sandra Avila wrote a great article on Buddhism and its relation to women and prostitution in Thai society. She says this: the reason why prostitutes are not viewed in a negative way in the modern Thai view, which derives from the Buddhist scriptures, is that their impurity is considered karmic impurity and not sexual impurity. The Human Rights Center, UNA PD, says this: as a preliminary note, it's necessary to admit that there is not such an explicit concept as human rights is classical Buddhism. Human rights are grounded on a Western form of individualism. Interesting. Lynn Thomas, exploring issues of human rights in the Indian text, says this: until fairly recently, much of the discussion of cultural relativism, broadly different from perspectives on the relationship between universal human rights and the ethical and social norms of diverse and particular cultures, has been conducted within a paradigm of compatibility in which existing historical cultures or traditions are measured against a set of overreaching norms and principles encapsulated by the notion of human rights. I know, lots of words. Within this paradigm, Hinduism has, for the most part, fared badly. By the way, just so you know, in the rest of the report, it fares even worse than that. Now, why am I showing you all this? Because what Doreen discovered at the very core of Hinduism, of Buddhism, of Taoism, and of the New Age movement is this. And again, this comes from Hinduism Today. Why is there so much happiness for some and suffering for others in a lifetime? The gods revealed to the rishis in their deepest meditations on the answers to these puzzling questions. They reveal the laws of karma and reincarnation, which are now two of Hinduism's most central beliefs. Karma is the law of action and reaction which governs life. If you cause pain to someone, you can be certain that that same pain will come back to you. It may not return immediately, maybe not even during this lifetime, but it will return in your next lifetime or even some life after that. Life does not end at the death of the physical body. The body dies, but the soul does not. It lives on in a counterpart of the physical body, which is called the astral body. This same cycle is repeated many times until the soul's spirituality unfolds and reaches a certain state of perfection and mature evolution. What are they saying? Well, let's take a look at this idea of Buddhism. This comes from that individual, I can't even say their name, but the book's called The Heart of Buddhist Teaching. This is what they say. Without suffering, you cannot grow. Without suffering, you cannot get peace and joy you deserve. Please don't run away from your suffering. Embrace it and cherish it. Go to the Buddha, sit with him, and show him your pain. He will look at you with loving kindness, compassion, and mindfulness, and show you ways to embrace your suffering and look deeply into it. With understanding and compassion, you will be able to heal the wounds in your heart and the wounds in the world. The Buddha called suffering a holy truth because our suffering has a capacity to showing us the path to liberation. Embrace your suffering, and it will reveal to you the way of peace. Now, why did I bring up this idea of human trafficking? Why did I bring up this idea of human rights? It's one of this interesting data point. In countries where Buddhism and Hinduism are the majority religions, it shouldn't surprise you that they have the highest rankings in regards to human rights violations. And not just human rights violations, they have one of the lowest records in regards to alleviating poverty amongst a certain class. Why is that? Because it is core to their belief system, their worldview. You do not have value. You do not have meaning. There is no God that cares about you compassionately. What I love about this statement is if you listen to this statement properly, if you read it, what it is saying is Buddha doesn't care if you are in pain. He will look at you lovingly and kindly, but he will do nothing to alleviate said pain. So imagine for a moment you were born in India, but you were born to a lower caste. You have no access to education, to food. What compulsion does a person who is Hindu have to help you? Not just India, but in countries that are Buddhist. Again, Thailand, Indonesia. Indonesia is actually more Muslim, but you get the idea. These countries don't have this. And again, why does the sex trade seem to flourish in Buddhistic countries? See, I always find it interesting when I talk to people who are really into Buddhism. And I've had these conversations before. The thing I try to say to them is, just, by the way, if Buddhism is so beautiful and serene and wonderful, why do they treat bodies as disposable? Well, they don't. Let's prove that hypothesis, shall we? Right? Remember I told you, every idea is an hypothesis you can test by external data points. And so what's interesting is that what Doreen discovered is at the end, the very core of this teaching, is at the end of the day, the universe doesn't care about you. That you're on your own, and that the pain that you're going through, well, it's you caused it. And if I try to alleviate that pain, well, I'm just going to keep you in the cycle of pain for longer. So instead, I'd rather let you suffer so that you learn your lesson, you rascal. And in your next life, you'll get a little bit better. Now, I came across this article. It caught my attention because, first of all, it was in Scientific America, so I didn't expect that. But the author, the title of the article is "Why I Don't Dig Buddhism." So, of course, I saw this article in Scientific America, so of course it caught my attention. So I'm like, what does this guy have to say? Well, let me show you. He says this. I've been brooding over Buddhism lately for several reasons. First, I read that Steve Jobs was a longtime dabbler in Buddhism. Actually, it's not completely true. He's also Hinduism as well, too, but perfect New Age combination. And was even married in a Buddhist ceremony. Second, a new documentary, Crazy Wisdom, celebrates the life of that individual who helped popularize Tibetan Buddhism here in the U.S. in the 1970s. Third, Slate magazine, for some reason, just republished a critique of Buddhism that I wrote 8 years ago. And once again, Buddhists are berating me for my ignorance about their religion. Superficially, Buddhism seems more compatible than any other religion with my skeptical, science oriented outlook. The Buddhist teacher Robert Thurman once told me that Buddhism is less a religion than a method for fulfilling human potential, a method as empirical in its way as science. Don't take my word for anything, Buddha supposedly said. Just follow this path and discover the truth for yourself. So, what I love about this article is that this individual writing this was somebody who was attracted to Buddhism. But he had a way of looking at it in the most honest way. He goes on to say this. One of Buddhism's biggest selling points for lapsed Catholics like me is that it supposedly dispenses with God and other supernatural claptrap. This claim is disingenuous. Buddhism is, at least in its traditional form, is functionally theistic, even if it doesn't invoke a supreme deity. The doctrines of karma and reincarnation imply the existence of some sort of cosmic moral judge who, like Santa Claus, tallies up our naughtiness and niceness before rewarding us with nirvana or rebirth as a cockroach. Pause. The thing that's interesting about Buddhism and Hinduism is that they say that there's a wheel of reincarnation where good and bad is ascribed to you, and that you will get it, the good or the bad, for the next life. The question I always ask, well, who defines good and bad? And why does good and bad seem to be Judeo-Christian? Like, I just wish they'd be more original and grab their own good and bad, as opposed to stealing from us. So when I always talk with these Buddhists and Hindus, and just so you know, Hinduism is my family background. This is not a subject that I am not unacquainted with. And so what's interesting is that this idea of the wheel of reincarnation, of karma and reincarnation, there seems to be this supreme moral judge at the very top that's saying, well, okay, you're a puppy kicker. Therefore, in your next life, you're going to be, I don't know, a short brown guy, middle-aged. Wait a minute. You get the idea, right? So it's like, okay, in the next life, you're going to get punished for this, or whatever that might look like. He says this, and this is the part that he picks up on that other people don't. Human suffering and death may appear laughably trivial. Instead of becoming a saint like Bodhisattva, brimming with love and for all things, the mystic may become a sociopathic nihilist. Nihilism is basically meaninglessness. But see, the interesting thing is if you take a look at, and again, please don't take my word for it, take a look at Buddhist or Hindu charities. You're going to have to look pretty hard and pretty long. They do exist. That's not the case. But it's not part of the culture. It's almost an adoption of Western understanding. Because within this idea is this idea of like, why would I alleviate your suffering? You're on your path of reincarnation. And your suffering is part of your refining process. Because there is no God. He doesn't care about you. Therefore, you have to provide your own salvation. Now, let me ask you something. How many of you feel qualified to provide your own salvation? You don't have to put your hand up or say anything. But the point simply is, I don't think I'm qualified to provide my own salvation. I like to think I could, but really I can't. Finally, he says this, which is kind of interesting. He says this, I have one final misgiving about Buddhism, or rather about Buddha himself. His path to enlightenment began with abandonment of his wife and child. Not wrong. Don't hear that talked about very much, do you? I'm going to achieve enlightenment by abandoning my wife and child. Actually, I think maybe more people might actually believe in Buddhism than they care to admit there, but that's a different conversation. So let me show you the idea, and let's extrapolate it. If God is impersonal, then your lot in life, your suffering, is because of your own choices, not He. I cannot alleviate your pain because ultimately this will help you. Your pain will help you. So I'm going to keep you in your pain. I'm going to keep you in your suffering because this is for your own good. You have no value apart from the wheel of samsara. Reincarnation has allotted you. Therefore, live, die, and hopefully you've learned your lesson. If you pursue, if you go, if you take Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, if you take the New Age movement, this is the core. This is why when people hear tragedies happen, sending my prayers for, sending good thoughts. Honestly, you can take your prayers and your good thoughts, and you can. Yes, that. I think people who are suffering, i.e., what's taking place in Syria, donating to the Red Cross might be a better idea. And just keeping your virtue signaling off the social media. Actually doing something tangible to help people. See, the core of New Age belief, the core of Hinduism, core of Buddhism, core of Taoism, is I don't actually have to do anything to alleviate your suffering. So if we extrapolate this out properly, well, what happened in Syria, the people suffering, and that, I don't know about you, but did you see that one picture of that one little girl covering her brother's head, had been there for hours upon hours, like I think a couple of days even? I look at that picture, I'm like, oh my goodness, right? But if you understand properly, well, that's her fault. Oh, wait, that's horrible to say that. I know. I don't believe that. That's what they believe. Because again, her suffering is part of her refining process for the next life. And so hopefully she learns her lesson in this earthquake, in this tragedy. And whatever tragedy you want to think about. Hopefully you've learned your lesson, so in your next life you'll get it better. You'll get it right. You know what's interesting about suffering? Suffering is a good teacher that A, control is an illusion. Remember that line? B, that you need something above yourself. But you know what suffering doesn't do? It doesn't point towards hope. Think of the moment in your life when you've been in the most amount of pain, that you've hurt, when something has not gotten right. When that happens, the future comes to almost like a pinpoint. You can't see almost past the next day. The despondency, the despair that you feel almost feels unbearable. If you're a human being and exhale carbon dioxide, you've all felt this at some point in time in your life. You have felt despair. Now, the core of what I've just told you today is that despair should propel you to be a better person. How many of you have ever felt to be a better person because of your despair? My guess is probably none of you. Do you see why Doreen and others who pursue this, there's an end result to this? And the end result is this kind of, I don't want to say sociopath, but I do want to say uncaring, unfeeling. Because that's the end result of this path. I was going to go through the Eightfold Path, but the Eightfold Path basically is for yourself and not for the betterment of others. Now, one person said to me, and I think they're absolutely correct, that Christianity has operated much this way in the sense that we care about ourselves. We're so worried about our own sin, our own salvation, that we don't care about others. And I think that's an absolutely correct critique of Christianity. People will say to me, I don't need to go to church to be a Christian. And again, I understand the sentiment. I would say it's a misalignment with Scripture, but I understand the sentiment. But again, why do I don't need to go to church to be a Christian? Well, my individualism, my spirituality is not dependent upon people I don't even like, or listening to a really long sermon by a short brown guy or whatever, right? All that stuff I don't need. And again, I understand, I get it. But at the core of the belief is this idea that you can create your own salvation. That you can somehow, some way, change yourself and your circumstances so that you will be able to, stand before God. And again, just to rip off Andy Stanley, you can't one another without one another. You can't do all the one another statements. Remember we looked at that last January? I know, right? But all the one another statements, I think there's like 68 of them in the Scriptures. Pray for one another, love one another, bear one another's burdens. All those statements, you need somebody else. And I always find the individuals who don't go to church or, whatever the terminology is, everything they do in their life is for themselves and not for the other. It's just a default of this. All right, let me close. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. Remember? Got to come back to the Bible. I love how Paul writes to the church in Ephesus. Once you were dead because of your disobedience and your many sins. You used to live in sin just like the rest of the world, obeying the devil, the commander of the powers of the unseen world. He is the spirit at work in the hearts of those who refuse to obey God. All of us used to live that way, following the passionate desires, inclinations of our sinful nature. But by our very nature, we are subject to God's anger, just like everybody else. What Paul is saying there is really important because if we are led to our own desires, our own inclinations, we don't tend to go towards God. pleasure, comfort, our needs, this is what we tend to default towards. But again, what I said to you before, I'll just remind you at the end. Carrying your cross was never meant to be comfortable. Carrying the burden of what it means to be a bearer of God's Holy Spirit in this world was never meant to be easy. And so what we've done with Christianity is we've made it a behavioral, deistic, kind of like think good thoughts and do good deeds. And all of that is a misunderstanding and a misrepresentation of the gospel. You don't do good deeds. You don't think good thoughts. You're a disciple of Jesus, and that transformation by the Spirit happens naturally. Verse 4 to 5. But God is so rich in mercy, and he loved us so much. Pause. I love the fact that throughout the Bible, it continually comes to this idea that God loves us. Buddha does not love you. Doesn't even care about you. The entire New Age philosophy is this idea that the universe does not care about you. The juxtaposition to that is God. But God is so rich in mercy, and he loved us so much that even though we were dead because of our sins, he gave us life when he raised Christ from the dead. It is only by God's grace that you've been saved. To see the difference between that and what we talked about this morning, you don't deserve salvation. There's nothing about you that can bring about the salvation for yourself. You can't be good enough. There's not enough deeds that you can do that is going to change the trajectory of your life. But God, so rich in mercy, because he loves us, because of his grace, provided us the way to him. I had this conversation in the lobby this morning. You missed it. We had this great theological debate. Not debate, just a conversation about what it means to be a Christ follower. And one of the things we talked about was this idea that it's not about getting it right, people. It's not about you getting everything right in perfection. It's the struggle with sin that is the most valuable piece. And in this case, I will say the suffering that Buddha likes to talk about a lot is actually valuable. It is valuable if it propels us to a creator who is what? Merciful and gracious. Not to a universe that doesn't care. It's not about getting things right. It's not about perfection. You all have struggles in this room that you don't want to talk about. You hope nobody ever finds out about, and you wish that God would get them out of your life. You know why I know that? Same way. I wish that some of the things that I struggle with, the thoughts that I have, whatever it might be, man, I wish God had like an eraser or a delete button to get rid of it. Wouldn't you love that? I became a Christ follower. So this addiction, this behavior, this compulsion, this thing about me, I don't have to deal with anymore. Instead, this thing, this addiction, this compulsion, this behavior, this thing you wrestle with, it actually becomes magnified, doesn't it? Why? Because now you're aware of what God expects. But you think to yourself, well, God wants me to be perfect. He wants me to get over it. No, he doesn't. He wants you to be honest about it. He wants you to present it to him so that you and he, through the power of the Spirit, can find transformation. No, you will never, ever in your life be done with sin. But you will have a path towards what? Mercy, love, and grace. That's who God is. And I believe the gospel, properly understood, properly spoken about to others, vastly superior to the New Age movement, to Buddhism, to Hinduism, to Taoism. Because at the end of the day, we want to be loved. We want to be known. And I think that as I've I know you don't think it's briefly, but believe it or not, it is briefly. It seems like something that we have forgotten about Christianity. And we're talking to people and we're wrestling with ideas and all that. But the core of the gospel is the creator of this universe knows you by name, created you in your mother's womb. And that same creator walks with you every day of your life until you take your last breath, but meets you on the other side of the door of death with a beautiful, wonderful, incredibly rich life that's after that. Not, again, entering back in the wheel of samsara, not, again, going back to the whole process of pain and suffering again. But once we embrace the final door that every human being has to walk through, on the other side of that is Jesus. And we don't have to be fearful. We don't have to be tentative. We don't even have to think, oh, maybe I'm not good enough. You're never good enough. But Christ in you is what God gives to us so that we may have abundant life that is far beyond any lie this world has to offer. Let's pray. Heads bowed, eyes closed. I know we do this every week.